In a major shift from the Fractal Define R6, we're now looking at the Cougar Conquer. There it is. What you see is what you get with this one. It kind of takes some pages from the Core series, Core P3, Core P5 from Thermaltake, in that it is effectively an open air case. You are one step away from being a test bench at this point, and that step is rotating it and maybe removing the glass. So this is the Conquer. It's a $300 case. We did the usual thermals and noise, although noise is obviously not really a big point of this, and went through the whole assembly process because basically build it yourself once you buy it and all that stuff. So we're going to review this today and see how it does on the bench versus everything else that's $300-ish. Before getting to those, this coverage is brought to you by EVGA and their 1080 Ti SC2, which we've recommended fairly highly for its build quality and the ICX sensors, which are kind of fun to play with. You can check our full SC2 review for the 1080 Ti if you're curious to learn more, or you can click the link in the description below to find the product page for the 1080 Ti SC2. So this case is obviously not really something that you're buying for value. So we can just kind of strike that immediately. We're not reviewing this for value today. Subjectively, you're going for looks. That's up to you. What I can tell you about is the build quality, the assembly, thermals, and noise. So build quality, it's all pretty thick paneling. So they have 4 or 5 millimeter thick tempered glass for each side, and then aluminum bars that jut out from a central aluminum frame. And the assembly is all done when you get it. So it does not ship built. So you screw together the bars. These feet provide a wide base to provide some stability, but ultimately you actually need this glass panel on for complete structural stability. Up until that point, it does kind of wobble and flex a little bit, and it's pretty easy to knock it over. However, once you have the glass panels on there, it has no knocking over issues whatsoever. This thing's not going to move at this point. It's moving the table more than anything else. So that's kind of what you get once you buy it. Just be aware that you're basically building it. It's not difficult to assemble. It's really not that much different from the Core P3 or P5, except in the visuals, and obviously those speak for themselves. Now, in terms of other things on here, it's got pretty easy access to everything. So you just remove a couple screws and you can push the entire front panel up like that, just hinge it like a helmet or something. Then at that point you get access to 3 120 bays. Cougar technically recommends in their manual that you install 1 fan up here as intake and then 2 in the front as intake. We did testing with that versus all 3 in the top intake. We'll have numbers for you in a moment. But the thing to keep in mind with a case like this is because it's basically open air and there's holes all over the place for the air to escape, the closer the fan is to the target, the destination, the better. And the way it's set up now is basically with 2 intake fans, that air is dispersing across the case before it ever really gets to the components with any meaningful pressure left to the airflow. Putting a fan in the top here, you're forcing air straight into the CPU cooler. So that's obviously going to work a lot better. So that's what you need to keep in mind thermally. In terms of the assembly process and the build quality, the aluminum is about 3 millimeters thick in most locations. And typically you would use that as a bragging point to say, we damp the lower frequency noises pretty well, but obviously that's irrelevant here. And the assembly process has you putting the power supply in the front. So it's mounted in the front bottom, which is sort of interesting for a few reasons. One of them is that because we're intaking from the bottom and the power supply is exhausting towards me right now, it's pushing that hot air straight into the GPU. However, Cougar actually did something here that is pretty clever. They just have a simple shield basically that redirects the air down to a point where it's not really causing any trouble at all. So that's good. They've done well there to think that through and not cause problems. The rest of the enclosure has you routing cables kind of through the front left around the back, and it's a little bit troublesome with the 8-pin or the EPS 12-volt cables. We're actually using an extender here because our cable for the power supply wasn't long enough stock. So something to keep in mind. And that may be true for some of the other cables as well. But that's just the nature of having a power supply mounted in the front and kind of hiding your power cable to the wall and all that stuff. The sort of elephant in the room with this case, though, is RAID Max. Probably never thought anyone would say that. RAID Max has come back from the dead or wherever they were And they have a case that's really similar to this. In fact, it has almost identical, if not identical, tempered glass side panels that have just been installed in a different way. They're basically flipped the other way around. And the feet for the case are almost identical, if not identical. That case is called the Raidmax X08. Theoretically, it has a lower price point than this one, which is $300 to $350 depending on where you look. The Raidmax case is pretty hard to find, but also we spoke to Cougar about this, and if you kind of look at Cougar's Twitter feed, they've been a little bit, I believe the internet commenters would say salty lately, but really it's just kind of tongue-in-cheek or really frustrated or pissed off sarcasm would be how I would describe it, where they've had tweets replying to Raidmax basically saying ours is the original design. So we talked to them about this because it's not uncommon, in fact it's actually very common, for case manufacturers to use the same tooling between them, rebrand it, change some colors, change some fans, and sell it for roughly the same price. That we've seen with the Silverstone cases that we talked about recently, the old Redline 05. We've seen that with the Charcoon ones that came out afterward. With the Antec case, there's about 6 cases that use that same tooling. This, however, is different. So we talked to Cougar about it, and they alleged that the original patent, and they sent me the Chinese original patent text, is assigned to Cougar. So apparently this design, according to them, is patented by their company, and it's supposed to be made exclusively by them or their parent company more appropriately. So we also asked if the same supplier is making the Raidmax cases and didn't really get a firm answer yet, but they're working on an official legal statement for us that we can share, and we'll see what's going on. But basically it sounds like Cougar is alleging that Raidmax is basically a knockoff. My word, not theirs. So that's what I'm taking away right now. It's hard to say if that's accurate or if they're just using the same supplier. I'm not in a position to answer that. We haven't been able to talk to Raidmax about this yet. So take it for what it's worth. But basically there are 2 versions of the same case is what you can take away from it. And one is cheaper, but it looks a bit different. So with that said, let's talk through some of Patrick's build notes here and his thoughts on the case during the build process. You can find his written review linked below, and then we'll get into thermals and noise after that. Starting off, the Conquer is a huge case. It's easy to underestimate its size in pictures because of its unusual shape, but it's large enough to easily fit a full ATX board at a diagonal angle, making it both taller and wider than standard cases. The vast majority of the chassis is constructed from 3 to 5 millimeter thick aluminum and glass on all sides, making it much heavier than the skeletal frame implies. It's technically an open-air chassis, but with a case-like frame providing mounting points for several fans. The case's appearance is a large part of what will make users love or hate it, the price being the second one. The translucent orange fans included with our review sample were lit by red LEDs, not the most pleasant combination, but otherwise looked fine if you consider that color to be good with your build. The Cougar Conquer does fit in visually with the rest of Cougar's product line, but it also bears a close resemblance to the Raidmax, again, X08. This is something to keep in mind if you want to find alternatives. However, again, it's a matter of whether that case is available and also whether it remains available depending on pending legal discourse. Building the case is straightforward if the instructions are followed and no parts are missing. Construction is solid. The body feels a little wobbly during installation without the added support from the glass and the balancing beams, but once they're in place, the case can be safely picked up and moved by pretty much any point except for the power supply and the PCIe brackets. The brackets do their job just fine, but they aren't heavily reinforced as the rest of the case is. The glass side feels somewhat token, given that the case is basically open to the elements, but they must be installed for the case to be fully stable. Good-looking cable management is a real nightmare in this case because of the dual-sided glass panels, but there are plenty of cutouts available for strapping cables to, and that helps make it a little bit easier, but you're still going to have to put in some effort to make it all tidy. The power supply is mounted towards the front of the case, so cables need to stretch a little farther than usual, especially, again, the 8-pin connector. Going on to thermals and noise, the Conquer would probably still be usable even if it didn't include any fans at all. It would rank around where the Thermaltake Core P3 falls, but it does include 3 fans. We installed them according to the manual, which shows 2 intake fans at the front of the case and 1 intake at the top pointing down towards the CPU cooler. We wouldn't always choose top intake. primarily for dust reasons, but the angle of the motherboard means that it's the most practical way to push air into our CPU heatsink, otherwise you're just fighting each other for air. For additional testing, we put all 3 stock fans in the top intake slots, since the 2 intake fans are fairly far away from the actual system and possibly limited in their effectiveness, as the air will, again, just sort of diffuse across the entire chassis and find the nearest exit. The active cooling and big open holes combined with the lack of filters makes the Conquer potentially dusty, more so than the passively cooled open air cases like the Thermaltake Core P3, but just make sure you do preventative maintenance. Focusing first on the stock Cougar Conquer configuration versus our top 3 intake setup, CPU temperature was 48.5 degrees Celsius over ambient when under a torture workload, and 42.4 degrees with all the fans in the top for intake blowing down to the CPU cooler. The top intake position is in a great spot to help the CPU temperatures, and the more fans, the better in this configuration. The stock top intake fan is placed directly below the cutout in the top panel of the Cougar case, removing any barriers to airflow. Comparing against other cases, 48.5 degrees Celsius is a lower CPU temperature than any other stock case we've tested, except for the Silverstone RL06, and 42.4 degrees is lower than anything on the chart altogether. The Conquer has the cooling advantage of the Core P3, being that it's open air and you can't get better than that, really. Anything else is just a box that insulates it, but it doesn't rely solely on passive cooling to pump the heat out of the case, although it could. The RL06 maintains its lead because of the huge volume of air pumped in a straight line through the case, and is only outperformed when 3 fans are positioned inches from the CPU intake. Most other cases we've tested try to balance airflow with noise suppression or visual style, and these 2 are clearly outliers from that norm. GPU temperature is 50.9 degrees Celsius in the stock configuration, with 53.2 degrees measured for all fans at the top of the case. The top intake fans aim air exclusively over the backplate, while the stock configuration with 2 intake fans in the front direct air directly into the GPU cooler. The distance from the front of the case to the GPU lessens their effectiveness somewhat, but the temperature reduction is measurable. One subtle but important feature of the Conquer is that, although the PSU is mounted at the bottom of the case with no shroud, an angled aluminum metal shield directs its exhaust downwards and away from the GPU fans. Comparatively, 50.9 degrees Celsius is an unusually low GPU temperature, among the best on our chart even. Unlike the CPU temperatures, this has relatively little to do with active cooling. Even without the benefit of fans directed into the cooler, 53.2 degrees is still a respectable score here. The biggest contributor to GPU cooling is the fact that the case has no bottom to block out cool air, no shroud to block access to air for an open-face card, no side panels to keep the air trapped in, and that there's no sealed top, again, that would keep the air trapped in, struggling to get out fast enough. The GPU's heat is able to naturally find pathways out of the case, keeping it cool over long uptimes. The 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme test lasts longer than our torture test and typically results in higher average GPU temperature. The Conquer managed 53.6 degrees Celsius, just slightly better than the previous champion, the View 71TG. We haven't tested every case with Firestrike, but it's safe to say that the Conquer consistently allows good GPU cooling. That's what you get with open air. With Blender next, and with the CPU render benchmark, we saw 36.1 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient for the Cougar Conquer, which supplied better CPU cooling than most of the other cases tested, but the RL06 does keep the crown for now. Rendering on the GPU averaged the GPU temperature of 24.6 degrees. It barely beat the RL06 here, making it the new leader. Both of these scores are extremely good, but the Conquer is still impractical for business use because of the lack of hard drive space, the lack of filtration, not to mention the size, the price, and the look. It could also be impractical for pet owners or those of you with children. For streamers, YouTubers, anyone who's an enthusiast and doesn't have the risk of external sources messing with your exposed components, it would be a good case for showroom or production use if you're trying to make the most of what you have in terms of visuals and showing off. As expected with noise, the Conquer is a noisy case with 3 120mm fans at full speed and with nothing to silence them or block the noise. 39.8 decibels is similar to the Cooler Master H500P and scores between other well-ventilated cases like the Fractal Meshify C and the Thermaltake View 71. Given the cooling performance overall, though, there's no reason to run the fans at full speed or even install all 3 fans. You could run without them, and then your noise level would be system noise. So it's a pretty good case overall in terms of thermals and things like that. Noise, maybe not so much, but again, when your temperature performance is as good as this is, you don't even need the fans really. You run them at a lower RPM, and you'll be about where the other cases are with similar or better noise levels depending on what you're using. So it doesn't really come down to thermals and noise. It comes down to price and what it is. This is going to be a highly polarizing design. You either love it or you hate it based on the visuals. And then the price at $300 to $350 for most retailers does immediately price out a lot of the market. This is a showroom case. It's similar and competes most directly with a company like Inwin, for example. The other competition would be something like the Dark Base Pro 900, $200 to $250. It's more practical. It's a bit more traditional in its format, but still has some flashy elements to it. You could also look at something like the Thermaltake View 71. It's got all the tempered glass, so it has some flair, and it's a lot cheaper. But neither of them really look quite like this. So this is pretty unique. And there's not a lot you can find other than the cloned RaidMax X08 that would provide a similar look. So if it's the look you want, really there's nothing I should or could say that would sway you otherwise, because there's no other options. But if you're just looking for an expensive, good case, again, we'd recommend considering this one versus some of the Inwin cases. They have a lot of them that are in this price bracket. You could look at the Dark Base Pro 900. You could look at the View 71. If you want an open air case that's really cheap and can be used as sort of a semi-test bench or wall mountable machine, the Core series from Thermaltake is very good and much cheaper. But again, they don't look quite the same. That said, the Core P3, Core P5 would be great options if you really just want something accessible that's still vertically mounting your computer. So overall, performance is great, but that's not the point, and you're also not competing with something like the Redline 06, which offers similar performance, if not better in some cases, and is $75. It's just not even the same category of competition, different divisions altogether. So the Conquer is certainly no bargain, but it's a unique look. That's up to you whether you like it or not. And the RaidMax X08, depending on how you feel about their current pending legal dispute between Cougar and RaidMax, that might be a cheaper option as well, but we'll see how that goes. So as always, if you want to help us out directly, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net/modmat to pick up one of our new mod mats like this one on the table. They are anti-static and come with a grounding strap as well. Subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.